Headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Well, listen, I mean, the obvious area to look at would be Ukraine. I mean, the history of Ukraine has been checkered. It has been disturbing. It's been chaotic, and almost up to the present day. This has never been a settled nation. Would that be fair?
Absolutely. The real point about the Ukraine, make the big contrast between us and them, between Britain and Ukraine, England and Ukraine. The frontiers of England are fixed effectively from the Norman conquest. Our basic institutions of government go back to 100 years later. They're 800 years old. The Ukraine isn't even a word on the map 50 years ago. It only becomes one in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War.
Sure.
There are literally no frontiers. You have this gigantic, featureless plain that stretches really from west of Berlin to virtually Moscow. It's fought over by empires, it's fought over by nomads, it's struggled over by different nations, you've got countries that are layered with a ruling class that speaks one language and a peasantry speaks another language. So, and of course, it's had the terrible, terrible imprint of Stalin. We're still in the aftermath of the horrors of the Second World War as we renew another set of horrors now. And just going back, by the way, to the stories that are coming out about the behavior of Russian troops, what we've all carefully forgotten between raised commas, is that Russian troops behaved exactly like that at the end of the Second World War. When they swept into Poland, well, Poland had been eradicated into what was Poland, across the whole of the way of East Germany, they raped and they killed and they pillaged. We, of course, didn't comment on it because then they were allies.
Is this it will sound crass putting it like this, is this a trademark, are you saying, David?
Yeah, Russia is this extraordinary semi-Asiatic, semi-European state. If you remember George Orwell in that wonderfully prescient, the kind of prophetic picture that he had of the world in 1984, he talks of us, Oceania, America, Britain, and then Eurasia. A great inflated Russia. It's a country that's been made in blood and violence. The virtually contemporary of Henry VIII is Ivan the Terrible, the fearsome. And he puts a permanent imprint on this place. And then at every stage in which the empire, because it quickly becomes an empire, is expanded, you get one of these great, terrible figures. You get Peter the Great. You get Catherine the Great. People say, oh, aren't women nicer rulers? Oh, no, they're not if they're given half the chance. And you get Stalin and you get Putin. Yeah. And they see themselves in this pattern of a country where the bulk of the population was in virtual slavery until the 1860s. The 1860s. And we talk about the wicked past of the British Empire. But it's also a country that produces these gigantic extremes of wonderful culture, of the magnificence of Tolstoy and of Tchaikovsky, and then the horror, which they were all aware of. And again, it's a country torn between East and West. The Russia going right back to Peter the Great, it's been torn by, does it want to become like the West? Or does it think it's got some completely authentic, different life? Rooted in the steppes, rooted in these vast plains, rooted in the birch trees. And finally, they've got a different church. They are the heirs, not of Rome. They're the heirs of Constantinople. They're the heirs of Byzantium. And Christianity there is something. The head of the Christian church in Moscow, in Russia, is passionately in favor of the invasion. Yeah. They are passionately nationalistic. This is a national view of Christianity that sees, as it were, Russia as a new sacred vehicle of something, some holy mystery. And which I just think we're getting it so awfully wrong. We're not trying to comprehend what we're dealing with. We're thinking that they're sort of next door neighbours.
Yeah, I was watching the Thatcher-Reagan documentary, and obviously Gorbachev features within that, and Brezhnev, who I think one could say would probably laid all the building blocks for perestroika and everything that came in that time, the fall of the wall and the big handshakes and a man we can do business with and the Iron Lady and all of that era, which looked like huge progress. You may have had a different view yourself. I always have this idea of a young Putin working at the KGB at the time, sitting there in the sidelines thinking, I'll change all of this one day. And of course, it turns out that he absolutely did. Was those moments where it appeared there was a semblance of, I wouldn't say harmony, but a relationship with Russia and the West? Will that go down as a mere blip in history?
No, it's an important stage. But it's one of those moments when Russia looks west, when Russia decides it's got to learn. I mean, if it turns out there is a defeat in the Ukraine, if it reverberates into Russia, you may well get one of those moments in which Russia rethinks. Interestingly enough, people have been making comparisons between what's going on now and the Crimean War of the 1850s, when again Britain and France directly fought Russia in the area where the conflict is taking place. But the thing that you've got to remember there is Russia was defeated by two other great Western powers. And there was then a dramatic moment of rethinking. The new Tsar, Alexander II, was ashamed of Russian backwardness. He thought that serfdom was a stain, and he decided to abolish it. He was a great reformer, and for his pains, he was murdered.
In terms of what is happening there now, David, and we are, watching these horrendous images come out, which, as you've articulated, is not or should not be a surprise. We know this is a hallmark.
Ian, can I just say again?
Please do.
I am not making light of it.
Indeed.
I'm saying this is something that happens repeatedly.
Yeah.
Again, they were doing we've just not noticed. Where are so many of the refugees that are crossing the channel coming from? They're coming from areas like Syria, where Russia has intervened to prop up the most monstrous, brutal, torturing, savage regime of Assad. So everywhere there is this footprint. We notice it because it's in Europe. It's next door. These are people which, sort of look like us.
And in terms of where it goes, what's interesting about this is what becomes of Russia. I mean, let's take a leap and say that in 2 months' time, this is all over. It is done and dusted. Where does that leave Russia? I mean, in severe isolation. Who then runs the place?
Russia is. So this again, Ian, is a myth that we're telling ourselves. Russia is merely confronted by 11 Western powers. If you look at the G20, that is the group of the world's 20 largest economies, only 11 of them have sanctioned Russia. And if you look at the other 9, these are the great countries of what we used to call the Third World. Yeah. They are Brazil, they are South Africa, they are India, they are Pakistan, they're Indonesia. Russia has flourishing relations with the lot of them.
So this will be in the grander scale then, that would suggest that any kind of sanction doesn't really touch the sides.
I don't think it does. And all will happen is that, again, I apologise for banging on about George Orwell, but he's so foreseeing. The world is splitting into 3 big blocks. It's splitting into Oceania, the English-speaking world, with Europe, with the European Union, we can now see as a kind of appendix. Europe left Britain. Britain didn't leave Europe. It's really important to get this the right way around. And then a somewhat weakened Russia, a gigantically strengthened China, and then this block of the vast new economic powers of the equator and on either side of the equator, playing off the 2 big powers, the liberal West and the profoundly illiberal Russia come China, and the Indias and the Saudi Arabias and the Turkeys. No, don't forget Turkey playing that extraordinary middle game. It's supplying weapons to the Ukraine. It's also managing negotiations very much in Putin's favor. That equivocation. The gas we are not taking, India is. The oil we are not taking, India is. Again, the intimate relations going across the Atlantic, going across to Brazil, and of course, complete dependent states in Latin America.
David, stay. I cut in, David, just because we have to take a short pause. We are going to come back with some more great points from Dr. David Starkey, historian and presenter, with us here on Talk Radio. People have called in, fascinated and I think delighted with your analysis of the EU leaving us and us not leaving the EU. Can you embroider on that a little bit for us?
Embroider seems about maybe have a little fanfare and variations surrounding it. Yes, well, what we've seen, of course, is that the EU is rapidly dissolving into series of competing nation states. The decision of the Hungarian people to re-elect Viktor Orban as their prime minister is the big bellwether. It's the big indicator this is happening. Because, of course, what we're seeing now is not this world that, the world that you referred to of 1989, when we thought international trade was going to make us all somehow simple and lovable and the lion would lie down with the lamb. We're seeing the real issues of foreign policy, of war and peace. And when it's war and peace, people don't look to a bureaucrat in Brussels. They look to their own government. They look to their own government that they can or should be able to elect or to throw out. They look to them. And you can see now Europe is finding it extraordinarily difficult to maintain any line at all. It's split into rival groups. There are those in favor of extreme sanctions, like the Baltic states and Poland. There are those virtually against sanctions, like Hungary. There are the very much aided by Greece and Italy. And there are, of course, those who pretend to want sanctions, like Germany, and do everything they can to hinder them. Because, of course, this wonderful engine of the German economy, that Germany, remember again, Ian, Germany isn't a state. Germany is a customs union. It's a machinery producing Volkswagens. It has got absolutely no other purpose whatever. And unfortunately, what Putin can do, he could tomorrow turn off the gas that ultimately makes the Volkswagens. And the thing stops. So we're seeing this whole notion that there is a Europe with a foreign policy, that there is a Europe with a set of values vanishing. We're also seeing the idea that America, the United States, was, do you remember under Obama, his new best friend was Angela Merkel, the special relationship with poor old clapped out Britain was finished. Oh, we couldn't be bothered with that. Have you noticed that's vanished like a puff of smoke? Yeah. Have you noticed that the only powers that have actually got the intelligence right on the Ukraine are what are called the Five Eyes, the English-speaking world, America, Canada, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand. The head of the French intelligence agency has had to resign because his predictions were such absolute rubbish. We're seeing again, Orwell was right. There really is a quasi-state, which is Anglo-America, which is, again, what Orwell talked about, the fusion of the British Empire and America. That is really the core of the West. I mean, all you've been hearing again about, the desire for war crime trials. And that is all the set of institutions that were invented by the English-speaking world from 1945 at the end of the Second World War. The trouble is, isn't it? They haven't worked. Have you heard much about the activities of the Secretary General of the United Nations in trying to settle the war in the Ukraine? You haven't heard a peep from him. Yeah. The only thing you have heard is the usual wail about global warming. The idea that you get agitated about global warming when you're on the threshold of nuclear war. So the United Nations have been as useless as the League of Nations.
Well, as we speak, David, our Foreign Secretary Liz Truss is making a speech about the situation in Ukraine. So if you were concerned that it wasn't in safe hands, then Liz Truss has clearly got everybody's back on this one, hasn't she?
Yes, but you see, I think, again, she's selling us a pup. I mean, Britain is taking an impressively principled line. Right, let's give the big tick. The problem is that we're talking as though we are enforcing an internationally, universally agreed set of standards, that everybody in the rest of the world thinks Putin is awful and should go. What I'm trying to say is that's not true. Remember, only 20% of the world's population is in a democracy. The rest aren't. There is all overwhelming evidence that there is the most intimate relationship, as indeed they told us, between China and Russia. That the authoritarian powers control most of the international organizations. You see, again, there was talk, everybody's saying, oh, we can't possibly, well, everybody on our side is saying, oh, we can't possibly meet Putin. He mustn't be allowed to go to the next meeting of the G20 in Indonesia. Indonesia has made absolutely clear that he is invited. China has pointed out no other power can throw a power out of the G20. Russia, again, because of the veto, can stop any official action by the United Nations.
Of course.
So, but the way again, people like Liz Truss and to an extent Boris Johnson and certainly Biden are talking, you would think that there really was a kind of world government that we controlled, that there was an agreed system of international law, that it was a bit, like if you go out and sock somebody on Shoreditch High Street, well, perhaps a copper will come along and pull your collar. That's not true. It's not true.
It is worth just very briefly, if we could, David, because we, as ever, time goes, it sort of runs away with us when we speak, which is both fabulous in one respect because there's a lot to be said, but always sad when we have to say goodbye to you. Many of our listeners and viewers have picked up on a few Orwell references. I think I said to you last time that 1984 is possibly one of my favourite books, if not the most frightening book I've ever read. Would it be fair to say that we hope that not everything in that book is as prophetic as we've been discussing here this afternoon, because that wouldn't be nice.
It would be horrible. But remember, there is one element of it which we haven't touched on, which is profoundly prophetic. The whole business of woke, of cancellation, of newspeak, is directly anticipated in that book. And it is, of course, the problem of the left. It's essentially tyranny comes from the left. The threat of tyranny within the West is from the West. A Twitter storm is exactly the same. I know, I've been at the end of one. Is exactly the same as the hate week in Brave New World. Yeah. The extraordinary perversion of language, which says, a trans woman is a woman, get over it, and trans man is a man, get over it. That's equivalent of exactly as George Orwell says, 2 + 2 = 5. I'm afraid Orwell predicted woke. Orwell predicted that perversion of language. The one thing that Orwell didn't get right yet is that we will go down the full route of totalitarianism in the West. But with COVID, we came horribly near to it. The ease with which we got a Chinese virus and then started marching towards a Chinese society. It's terrible. In other words, we've all got vigilant. It's true. Get a Chinese virus, finish up with a Chinese society, because you've got politicians who understand your own system so badly that they impose the Chinese method of a lockdown, which, as Lord Sumption said, should have been unthinkable in the West. But in other words, permanent vigilance. Liberty needs vigilance. We've all got careless. I think it's vigilance in foreign policy, vigilance at home.
It would be great. I mean, we have talked across many subjects over the months you've been coming on with us, David, and maybe next time we can have a specific focus on some of those issues of free speech and liberty and lockdowns and all that goes with it. But as ever, David Starkey, thank you.
Good talk. Hot talk.
Bold talk. Talk radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.